Welcome to the AIOps Evolution Weekly broadcast. This series features discourse on topics pertinent to the C-level conversation revolving the integration of artificial intelligence into the ever-evolving IT operations landscape. Discover trends and actionable tips for digital transformation, as well as the latest news on how AIOps is transforming business and government operations to create flow in their organization. And don't stay in the dark on the latest industry news. Join the AIOps Evolution community to stay connected and subscribe to the show at AIOpsevolution.com. Now, let's join our hosts, Sean McDermott and Bill Driscoll, IT thought leaders, visionaries, and the voices on the other end of the mic for the latest episode of AIOps Evolution Weekly.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's AIOps Weekly broadcast. I'm your host, Sean McDermott, and my co-host, Bill Driscoll. Bill, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Sean. How about yourself?
Good. You have a good week?
Yeah, it's been a good week. It's been busy. Lots going on, which are good problems to have.
Yeah. I actually, I took my daughter to college this past weekend, so it's nice to get her all settled in and squared away and back to work, focused on things. So,
yep.
You want to you got anything coming up this weekend? I'm sorry?
Yeah, we're actually last trip to the beach. So I haven't been there since June. So it will be a weekend trip with some friends who nice enough to let us crash at their place. So looking forward to that. Then it's back to the fall.
Those are convenient friends.
Yeah, it's nice. Yeah, it's good to have friends.
I'm glad. Yeah, pretty much everyone's heading back to school now. So back to reality of the summer. It's kind of crazy. The summer's already over, you know?
Yeah, we were down south a few weeks ago, and I think the farther south you go and west, that starts earlier. Like our kids don't go back till after Labor Day, but lots of places are been back a week or two now.
Yeah, so I'm outside of Orlando, a little bit north of Orlando, and we went back. This is now week 2. Yeah. Maybe week 3. Yep. So they've been back for a while. So
good.
Kind of crazy because, up north, you're right. So you want to talk a little AIOps before the weekend?
Yep, that sounds like a plan. So you want me to cover this first article here?
Yeah. You seem pretty excited about this one, so I'll let you jump in and lead off.
Yeah, sure. So the first article we chose was from the CTO and founder of Dynatrace, really about how to drive more effective automation with a new approach to AIOps. And I think, he mentions the new approach, which I don't know if it's new, but it's really boil the ocean approach. It's the whole key here is it's about scope. And I think we mentioned Dynatrace in the past. They're really one of a few vendors that are really aspiring to kind of eat everything, right? They want metrics, logs, traces, but go well beyond that to the user experience and tests and any kind of context data, and really pull that under one umbrella. And so he's really espousing this vision of, if you're not eating it all, you're not pulling it all in and bringing in the data, you're not structuring it, you're not putting the right context to it, and it's all in one system, then you're really you're missing a big part of what AIOps is all about. And so Dynatrace, as we know, it's doing infrastructure monitoring, application, digital experience, as well as the business, bringing in business data. And so he talks about BizDevSecOps is really that vision. And so I think that's really what he's promoting here. And like I said, Dynatrace is one of the few that are really going after that, where there's a lot more niche vendors doing pieces of it. But I'm curious to get your thoughts as to what you thought of the article and kind of what he's espousing.
Yeah, so for me, the first thing is BizDevSecOps. I mean, how many words can we stick together in one thing? But I won't harp on the grammar side of this. There's a couple of things that kind of stood out to me here, and what I liked about it was the fact that he was talking about AIOps in a broader sense, and not just use cases, kind of standard use cases of event collection, incident management, which I think is very important for people to understand. If you're doing what we would suggest you do at looking at AIOps as a strategy, and when you start looking as a strategy, it starts becoming much bigger than event management, correlation, incident management, and that's where a lot of the AIOps vendors today are. So this is, I think this is a really key thing, not necessarily really super important today as people are getting into AIOps, because I think that if you're going to get, if you're thinking about getting into AIOps right now and bringing in, machine learning technology, picking a couple use cases and picking the kind of standard use cases like event management is a good thing. But understanding a broader vision, I think, so I like that. I like the concept. He made a statement called AIOps is what it eats, back to the data, right? It's only as good as the data you can feed into it. And I think he makes a really good point that unstructured data can be very difficult, and the data sources can be extremely varied across different data silos. So being able to structure that data and create some type of common data model is really important. So that is really important when you start looking at the broader context of data consumption in AIOps. So if you're looking at a use case, you can say, well, we're going to consume, 3 or 4 streams, with the main stream being something like Splunk. Then that's okay, but it's not going to scale, right? It's not going to scale when you start looking at microservices and things like that. And I think he brings up, so I get a lot of questions. So I'll stop there. Did I? Because I got some other thoughts, but I don't want to
No, I think that all makes
sense.
Of you. I was going to say that I think that's. I lost my train of thought here. One thing you did say about structured and unstructured, that was one of the things I was going to highlight. That I think bringing in structured data is important, and figuring out how to structure it. And he talks about open telemetry and standards can contribute to that, but of course, big vendors are doing that as well. But I think one of the biggest points that he didn't directly say, but knowing what we know about Dynatrace, is it's about how do you bring all this information together into a user operational experience, because it isn't just the AI and the machine learning that needs to understand that context. It's really the operator when they're working on an event, they need to be able to see, well, what is the transactions, what's happening there, what's happening with the performance data. I need to look at the topology. I need to see the relationships between the events. I need to see probable causes or symptoms. And so I think there's tools like this that it's not just the algorithms. It's those algorithms aren't just driving automation. They're driving the operator experience and pulling all that information together and putting it in context when you're dealing with an issue, or you're troubleshooting, or you're trying to work on some sort of optimization. And so I think that's a key point that he didn't directly say, but I think that is just as valid.
Yeah, I think clearly with this article, he was focused on the data consumption, right? And he makes a point, and I think this is a good point that he brought up, because I get a lot of questions on around complexity and why is this why can this be so complex? And the example he gives is in days of past, right? There were more monolithic type systems out there that were collecting data and doing some type of normalization and forwarding that information on, or using that data. So like the days of Micromuse and any of these old legacy event management platforms, you would just kind of point data to it, or poll things based on SNMP. But as cloud it became more and more important, and you start looking at containers and microservices, he brings up a really, really good point, and that is there hasn't been any kind of consistency of instrumenting some of these applications from an observability perspective. So dev teams are kind of on their own to basically say, hey, I've added a few lines of code that allow you to pull data, but there was no structure to it. There was no commonality of data structure. Right. So it puts it on puts it on the onus of the operations team to build systems to then transform that data. And he talks about open telemetry, which I think is a really interesting topic around compatibility, standardizing monitoring and observability aspects, so that when a DevOps team, application teams are building applications and they're trying to put in code related to observability, they have a standard by which they can do that allows downstream collection of data much, much easier. So he brings up a lot of really good points with this and this article and around a data model. And I know that in my past life, when we started Real Ops in the early 2000s, and we were integrating into all these different applications, it became very, we built a common data model, right? Because when we were integrating into 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 different monitoring systems, the structure of that data coming in, we couldn't do any kind of standardized process automation or workflow because we had to get everything into a common language first. So we had a transformational layer that brought in all this data, and something might be called an IP address, another one might be called host ID. We had to basically convert that into a common data model, and then all our workflow fed off of that. It's the same thing happening here in AI ops with this data, is that we're consuming lots of data. The data has to be transformed into a common model so that you can start writing fewer algorithms to do more things.
Yeah, you can't. I'm thinking of the UN as you're talking. You can't have the UN of data, right? Then you there's no such thing as AI diplomacy. So, just a side note there that I think that you gotta standardize. You got to get on the same language, the same format, and that's really what machine learning algorithms are trained to do, right? Not to interpret just any kind of random format out there. So you bring up there's a second article,
and I think, like I
go ahead, Sean.
No, just kind of one last thought on that. Not to beat a dead horse, but I think that it ultimately it may not matter right now, right? So if you're basically saying I'm going to work on an AI ops initiative with a particular use case, and I have a discrete number of data sources that I'm going to kind of be working with, it may not be as important. But when you're looking down the road, thinking about the common data model and how you're going to do all this and how you're going to transform this data and clean the data before it gets into your AI models is going to be really key. And I think as we talk to customers about the vision of AI ops, they need to understand that and kind of put that into the track of long-term scalability. So I will end on that note because I could go on this all day.
So speaking of other large vendors that are out there trying to play in the space of AI ops, I think the second article is from another one of those.
Yeah, so it's actually an interview with the CTO of BMC, Ram Chakravarti. Full disclosure, I actually used to work at BMC. We sold my company to BMC in mid-2000s, and I worked there for a year. I don't know Ram, and he was not CTO when I was there. But yeah, so this is an interview. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but there was a couple things because most of this is, I think this was a lead up to the AI and Big Data Expo Global, which is going to be in September 2021 in London. I don't know much about this expo coming up, and I don't know how well it's going to be attended, but I don't even know if it's live at this point, but so I think this was a lead-up article to that, and they were talking about BMC's they coined this new phrase called autonomous digital enterprise. Okay, I think I think that's maybe it will turn into something, or maybe it's just a marketing term that they're basically going around talking about. I mean, they were basically the architects of business service management, BSM, back in the 2000s. Yeah, so I don't know how much this term autonomous digital enterprise is going to become a common term in the market, but BMC does have some experience with business service management and coining that term back in the 2000s, which lasted a pretty long time. But he talks about the value of AI ops, all the things we talked about, processing large amounts of data, automating manual tasks, things like that. Won't go into that. But he did bring up something that I thought was, he brought up the idea of talent management, and we've had this conversation a lot, right, about and how AI ops is going to, organizations are going to need to embrace new approaches to talent management, optimize technology spending. We've talked about that, and I think we're going to be talking about more of that in the future. But he did bring up something that I thought was, and I'm not sure he even meant to, but it was kind of interesting and kind of got me thinking. This idea of tackling social engagement, right? And I think what he was saying was automated digital enterprise is going to be pulling data from a lot of different sources. And it kind of got me thinking that we as IT operations people, we're looking at instrumentation of systems and data, and pulling all that data. But there's another facet of this, and that is, can we start looking at social engagement? Can we start looking at text analytics of surveying and things like that to understand how we're doing and bring that into the operations environment? So, for example, if you're a large company like Apple, right, and you're surveying your customers on the performance of some of the services, whether it be Apple Music or Apple TV, things like that, that require, internet connections and it's an online experience. It would be interesting to start tapping into those surveys and looking for sentiment and things like that, and pulling that into the operational environment. And I think there's a lot of ways that organizations can start looking outside the traditional IT environment to for new points of data that we haven't thought about in the past.
Yep. No, I totally agree. I wrote down a note when I read about that, and customer engagement and social media data kind of really playing in here is, if you're in IT and the customer experience is good and it's trending to be good overnight, and you've got this IT issue potentially, you can go home and just deal with it tomorrow, right? And so I think that ultimately, IT, you can constantly be chasing performance. We can constantly be resolving things, but a lot of IT is built in a resilient way. And really, if the customer is not experiencing, or they're not getting the transcendent customer experience, then you can put it off to tomorrow, or you can resolve it. You can treat it in the normal course of events. And so I think it is critical that IT, one, the user experience, the operator experience needs to see that, right, and say, where are we actually trending downward? And social media is almost
Twitter
is pretty real time. It isn't just surveys. There are products out there that are constantly bringing in comments being said, and that happens, almost instantaneously, as much as systems notify. And I think if IT can have a view into that, and the critical thing is tying their services and the service catalog or the portfolio and the performance of that to the data that's coming in from social or customer engagement. I mean, that's invaluable, and be able to see that in the same sort of operating dashboard, so they can make those kind of decisions. And ultimately what it drives is the urgency, right, of how quickly do we need to respond and resolve those issues. So, I mean, I think a lot of his theme, like in the last article, was about breadth of scope, and I think it's the same thing here as well. He talks about IoT and manufacturing and cell towers, and the talent is really not just applying AI to the IT, but it's AI to customer sentiment, to social media, and then the non-IT.
Yeah, he definitely hit more on the IT specific stuff, right? And we've talked a lot about instrumenting IoT, and that's a key thing, right? I mean, that's a key value proposition of AI ops. But the social aspect, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I think, certainly as an IT organization, you don't want to be relying on your customers telling you when to have a problem, right? You want to be kind of the point of AI ops and processing all this mass amounts of data is to be looking at, outages and predictability of outages, but being able to pull in sentiment, because I know I've gone on Twitter a few times looking for status on something to see if other people are having problems, even if it's like in the neighborhood. So these social aspects have actually morphed into not just a way of connecting people kind of asynchronously, but becoming real time real-time temperature gauges of what's going on out there. And I think, one of the things that, a lot of work that we do in cybersecurity, we're starting to kind of look at, reputational analysis of vulnerabilities and that, so I think it's kind of the same type of element. So it's an area I'm going to be keeping my eye on. I thought it was just an interesting part of that article, probably to me the most interesting thing. And so that was that's what I had on that.
Great. All right. Good. Well, the last article we had here was kind of the main topic we want to talk about. Was written by somebody we know. I know a few weeks ago we covered an article I had written, and this time, an article you published last week, Sean, under the Forbes, kind of as a council member at Forbes and as CEO of Windward Consulting Group. So the title of the article you wrote was AIOps gives you an innovative and competitive edge, but not before overcoming these roadblocks. You talked about a couple key roadblocks about, how we get to the ROI of AIOps, also the cultural mind shift. And you talked a lot about culture and really the adoption of that, as well as a few other things. But, I thought it'd be interesting to get, maybe you give us an overview as to why you wrote the article and what you were really trying to get across.
Well, first of all, I heard the author is a very prolific writer, so.
Yeah.
I think that.
I noticed I was reading it for a long time.
Yeah, you read it. I think you read it like 5 times is what I read.
It's very good.
You were just mesmerized by it. I think this is one that got picked up by Forbes, so that was kind of fun. So I wrote this because one of the things that I see a lot with our customers is trying to figure out how to get started on these and how to build momentum. And one of the things I think a lot of people tend to, and I myself do this, and so I'm guilty of this too. Of you kind of have this big vision, and you start visualizing what you can do, and you kind of get into it, and you kind of maybe get a little ahead of your skis on getting everybody else on board to what you're trying to do. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I talked about is how to kind of focus in on one area. And the other thing is I think there's a fair amount of misunderstanding or misconceptions about AIOps just because it starts with the words AI, right? And we've talked about this in the past where, there's a certain amount of discussion going on about AI in the world today and how it's going to change the world. And I think Elon Musk said it's the existential threat to human mankind, which I found super interesting because 2 weeks ago, he basically came out and now, or last week announced the robot, the AI driven robot. Yeah. So I guess he doesn't think it's such an existential threat. He can't make money off of it. But I think that some organizations, they get a little ahead of their organization, their vision, because a lot of these IT leaders, if you're a visionary, you are ahead of it, people, right? And you got to take time to kind of step back and say, okay, how do we take this vision and how do I get people involved? How do I get people feeling good about it? So one of the things I wrote about is just starting small, kind of the concept of don't try and eat the whole elephant. So find a business use case and really focus in on that and try out different platforms or different technologies and start small, right? And show the value of that. And I think that's going to highlight a lot of things in the organization, like where you might have organizational issues, where you might have people who are resistant to change, and where you might have data problems and data cleanliness problems, and where you may not exactly understand the results you're trying to get to. So trying to apply AI, AIOps, and machine learning to a known problem is a good way of starting so that you can actually have some baseline to understand, are we meeting the problem? Is the problem being, so let's say you start an incident management, right? Or event alerting. Are we getting the results that we expected, right? So it's almost like doing a science experiment, kind of knowing what the results should be and making sure that you actually kind of get to that point, right? Because at that point, you're looking at speed and accuracy. and then you're getting people to see that, hey, this isn't necessarily going to impact me and my job. It may make my job more easier, right? So you can use it as a way, and then start building from there. So that was kind of the first thing I was talking about.
Yeah, to that point, we just spoke earlier this week with one of the largest wireless providers, and they talked about how, really a year or two ago, it was about a 3-year sort of AIOps machine learning roadmap. Nowadays, they're looking in 3-month increments and short term, and they really have sort of two-pronged approach, which they've got an in-house development approach to machine learning, and really a whole machine learning team using open source and coding themselves while they're experimenting with a few of the key vendors that they work with and looking for opportunities there. And they've kind of given up on the whole, like I said, eat the elephant of we're going to try to pull every metric, every log, everything into a huge data lake. It's really about what's the ROI for things they do today. And they're approaching it from a couple different perspectives of that. Development in-house, obviously is an extremely large company, but some of the vendors that they're working with today. And I think that's a much more pragmatic approach. And I think they're trying to shift that culture to, you've got to get ROI, and you've got to make the objectives. You got to bring the vision, and the mission can still be there, but you've got to break it into smaller chunks and focus on what wins you can get in the shorter term. So I think, yep.
Yeah, I think that, I'm not even a golfer, but I think you can equate this to golf, right? And you've got the match that's 18 holes, and you certainly can go into the match with an idea of how you're going to play the entire course, right? And whether you're going to be aggressive off the tees, or whether you're going to try and be more surgical, maybe a little less yardage because of wind conditions and things like that. But ultimately, you still got to play hole by hole, right? And when it comes down to it, and I think that that's one of the things that, I'm glad to see that company is doing that, because I think that's the right way of doing it. Have a long-term vision, have the long game in mind, but implement, in small pieces so you can understand what the impact is. And then you can always start speeding up, right? You can get bigger. And so the second thing I talked about was, increase operational efficiency. So start really looking at the use case and what you're trying to do. Have a very clear idea of what the results you're looking for. And that way you can start looking at, sorry, I just got a whole bunch of shit just popped up on my screen. So I am going to start over. So the second thing I talked about was increasing operational efficiency. So what I was talking about there is really trying to understand how what you're trying to get out of a particular use case, and understanding the intended results and the intended impact. And by doing that, you're able to articulate that particular use case upwards and around, so people can say, this is what we're trying to achieve here, and really start looking at, as a primary example, operational efficiency. Because in the operations world, as you know, Bill, efficiency is the name of the game, right? How can you do more with less? And every year that's about, so using operational efficiency as kind of the main results and impact driver is a really good way of articulating value proposition to everybody on your team, and even to people above you, that you basically have gotten approval to say, hey, let's start looking at AIOps, and you're now leading it. You want to show tangible results to people, and using operational efficiency as one of those tangible results will.
One of the things I took from the article, but I don't know if you intended it, and I'm curious to get your thoughts as well, is you talk about, it's a really good point. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think you said,
it's a really good point,
then I intended from the summary. That IT teams need as much time as possible to innovate and improve the product. And then you talked later about forecasting and predicting challenges, and that you want to use this data to look ahead and say, where's performance trending, where are the use cases or the uses going, and can you use AI to try to drive improving the product or innovating in the product. So I know we talk a lot about AIOps as being responsive to incidents and events and performance and keep things running today well, the operating efficiency. But were you intending to talk about how AIOps can start being applied to providing insights into where the product needs to improve or where services need to improve, so that IT leaders are really focusing on some of those use cases or ROI as well?
Yeah, I was actually. I was looking at AI as a way, AIOps as a way to provide feedback loops, right? And because ultimately, if you looked at, ITIL, right, continual service improvement, it really is all about moving through a wheel and getting back to the point of being able to increase the availability of service and the quality of the service. So I think, AIOps can actually start looking at this experience of some of these user experiences and provide that feedback to other organizations, whether it's engineering or something like that, to tweak and release new offerings and get that data back to the people who are designing these services. So when they roll out version 2, version 3, or whatever, they're just better, right? So it has to be, and I think that's a fundamental aspect of operations, should have been, maybe not as well implemented in the real world, but and it actually is reflected in ITIL, right? This idea of it's ultimately all about continual service improvement. And I think the more operations can bring data and information back to the enterprise architects and the application developers to make their product better, then the better the service will be and the less issues you're going to have. It just becomes this ultimately revolving loop. So I think AIOps plays a huge role in that, of being able to do.
I think that brings us full circle, doesn't it?
Information back to the dev teams.
Yeah, I couldn't help it.
I think it does. So, well, thanks for asking me about my article. So, well, I think that's it for this week, and I appreciate everybody tuning in. So my name is Sean McDermott. Again, Bill Driscoll. We're the hosts of the AIOps Evolution Weekly. You can also check out our podcast, the AIOps Evolution Podcast. Season 1 is out right now. We're in pre-production on Season 2, with expecting to deliver that. That's going to be released in October of this coming October. So again, I want to thank our sponsor, Windward Consulting. Windward Consulting is the global leader in AIOps, and you can find them at www.windward.com.
Sounds great. Talk to you later, Sean.
With that, I thank everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Bill, I'll see you next weekend.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation about AIOps and the future of IT operations. Interested in a deeper dive on these topics? Check out our resources available at AIOpsevolution.com. And remember to subscribe to get the latest episode.